Man, what a fun day. What a fun series that we have been in. Okay, I don't know if you guys have ever had a moment in your life where you did something and it was wrong, but it kept working out. And so because it kept working out, you thought that maybe it wasn't that wrong. I'll give you an example from my life. Okay, so several years ago, on New Year's Eve, me and my sister, my wife, and her husband, we go to St. Louis on New Year's Eve. Now, before you get pictures of us at St. Louis on New Year's Eve, we went there to go to City Museum. We went to bed early. That's what we were doing. We just, whatever. But so we go to St. Louis, and we got our hotel on Hotwire. And the cool thing about Hotwire, for those of you watching online, is that if you can get really nice hotels for pretty cheap, but you usually get not their greatest room, but you just get this. So we had this really awesome hotel in downtown St. Louis, and I'll never forget walking into the room. Okay, so we're in this really nice hotel, but we have the cheap room in the nice hotel, and we walk in, and when we walk in the hotel, the doors, it's one of those adjoining rooms, okay? And the doors are open to the room that it's connected to. Okay, so the honest thing to do in that moment is to call the front desk and let them know. We did something different. So what we did is we walked in this room, okay? And it was the nicest room in the whole hotel. If the president stayed in that hotel, they would have stayed in that room. It had one of those jacuzzis that no one really uses, but they're there and you like them. It had one of those showers that had the rain that fell from the sky. It had king-size beds and had this nice sitting area, and the TV was huge. And I remember walking through, exploring the room with my family, thinking, this is the moment we've been waiting for. So we're okay, so we've got this, it's open, we have both of these rooms. And so what we did is we got our suitcases, and we put them in the nice room. And we put them in the beds, on the beds in the nice room. And then we're okay, so how do we make it so that we can keep this? And so what we did is we have the bolt lock in the hotels. So we bolt locked the nice room, because you can't break through that. So we bolt locked that room, and then we're well, we got to eat dinner still. And so we're and then they're going to come to our room. And so what we did is we put a do not disturb sign on our door, thinking we have accomplished this ruse that will result in us having the presidential suite in this really nice downtown St. Louis hotel. So we're all right, this is really cool. And so then we're heading to the place we're going to have dinner. And as we walk through the hotel, I remember looking over to my sister, and I was man, Katie, the Lord has been good to us. I know, it's kind of embarrassing to say out loud. And I'm Kate, I think that God is blessing us for being faithful to Him. And I'm a youth pastor, and so maybe that He knows, the Lord knows I can't afford this room, so this is a way that He's giving it to me. And just as a general rule of thumb, if you have to lie to keep something going, it's probably not God's will. But and so then we have dinner, and then we come back to the hotel room thinking that we're going to live it up I don't know, Paris Hilton or whatever, and we go in, and our suitcases are on our bed. The door is locked, but the do not disturb sign is still on the door. So I don't know what happened when we went to have dinner, but I know that we didn't sleep in that room as much as we tried. But sometimes this is what happens, though. Something will happen in your life, and you interpret the circumstances, and you think, well, because this happened, surely this is God. Surely God isn't that frustrated. He wouldn't have opened this door for me if He didn't want me to walk through it. And that's really the circumstance that happens here in the text. That in the text that we come to this morning, it's in 1 Samuel chapter 27. That it's a circumstance where you have David. And if you're just going to interpret the externals, or the results of what happens, you could look at what David does and say, well, he got everything he wanted. But what we see in the text is that just because you might get what you wanted. It doesn't mean that you are in the center of where God wants you to be. And he might have a way that he wants you to get there that is maybe above board. So if you got a Bible, we're going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 27, and we will start in verse 1. And if the story sounds familiar, it's because it kind of is. 27 verse 1. It says, "Then David said in his heart, 'Now I shall perish one day by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than that I should escape the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will despair of seeking me any longer within the borders of Israel, and I shall escape out of his hands.'" Okay, so this verse, we're going to come back to it. It's really important. That's kind of how we'll land this morning. Verse 2. "David arose and went over, he and the 600 men who were with him, to Achish the son of Maoch, the king of Gath. And David lived with Achish at Gath, he and his men, and every man within his household. And David with his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel, and Abigail of Carmel, Nabal's widow. And when it was told Saul that David had fled to Gath, he no longer sought him." So I just want to look a little bit at this sentence, at the setting that we're dealing with here this morning. And the first thing I would point out is that so David is going to Achish, king of Gath, really seeking asylum as he's trying to save himself from the hand of King Saul, who wants to kill him. And if you remember in 1 Samuel chapter 21, David's already done this before. That in 1 Samuel chapter 21, he goes to the same king of Gath and seeks asylum in hopes that his life will be spared. But what happens in chapter 21 is that he goes to Achish and he's like, "Hey, can I stay here?" And Achish's men are like, "No way, David can't stay here. They wrote a song about David killing Philistines. Like, you can't let this guy live in the palace." And so Achish has this epiphany, and he's like, "You know what? We probably shouldn't have him here." And David realizes his life's in danger. So in chapter 21, what David does to escape from Achish is he acts like a crazy person, and Achish is like, "I don't need any more crazy people. Just get him out of here." And he goes and he leaves. And now here we are, just a few chapters later, and David is back doing the thing that he did first. And okay, isn't that an interesting picture of us when we're desperate? Like that when we're desperate, when our back's up against the wall, we feel like we've exhausted all of our options. What do? Is we often go back to options that we've already tried that didn't work. But here you have David, he's doing this. He goes to Achish saying, "Hey, I know that you said no once before, but it would be great if maybe you gave me another shot." And you see why. That right now at this point in David's journey, he's got 600 people with him, 600 men with him, who are helping him fight, who have essentially hitched their wagon to David, the king of Israel, hoping that someday David's going to be king, and so they're just like, "Man, hopefully this is going to pan out for us." And they learn what the song Rocket Man says, and it's that Mars ain't the kind of place to raise your kids. That on the run, that's not a great place to build a family. And so they're thinking, okay, we've got to settle that. We've got to stop moving so much. There's got to be a place where we can go and establish some roots. And so they're like, maybe we can try Philistine country. Because what's happening here is that being on the run is taking a toll on David's men and their families. And now I would draw your attention because it would be very easy just to skip over the fact that David has 2 wives. But I put it in bold so that I couldn't. And you see that, and you're like, "Man, what in the world? He had 2 wives?" And you're like, "Abigail, is that the one we talked about on Mother's Day?" Yes, that's the one we talked about on Mother's Day. And so there's some things in the Bible that are meant to be like prescriptive. So when you see it, it's like, "Hey, you should do this." And then there are things in the Bible that are meant to be descriptive. And they're just saying like, "Hey, this is the way that it was." When you see someone who is married to 2 people, that is descriptive, not prescriptive. And if you follow David's life and you consider that 1 and 2 Samuel were likely written by the same person, 2 Samuel, David's life unravels. That this man who had all of this promise, all of this like hope, like there was so much hope wrapped up into David. And if you were to just kind of like put a finger on what it was that caused his unraveling, it would be his multiple relationships with multiple women. And so it's almost like what the author of 1st and 2nd Samuel is saying is they're saying this is a bad thing, and this is what led to David's demise, and you see it in the results that come. And so you've got that there, but even as all this is saying, you got David on the run, going to enemy territory, seeking asylum, which I don't think is showing a lot of trust in God. You got the fact that now David's got 2 wives, which is against God's plan and design and rule. Even though that's the case, still there in verse 4, Saul no longer sought David. That even though he was doing the wrong things, he's still at this place where Saul is done seeking him. He's doing God's will in his way, but he's still getting the things. I think it's an interesting picture of Saul. That what got Saul to stop pursuing David was to David to seek asylum with the people that Saul's supposed to be pursuing. It just shows how Saul wasn't committed to what God asked him to do. So you have this happening. David's kind of things are falling here. And then you just see God's favor continue to rest on him as we look at verse 5. Look at this. It says, then David said to Achish, if I have found favor in your eyes, let a place be given to me in one of the country towns. Doesn't that sound nice? It's like talking about clever. That I may dwell there. For why should your servant dwell in the royal city with you? So that day, Achish gave him Ziklag. And therefore Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah to this day. And the number of days that David lived in the country of the Philistines was 1 year and 4 months. It's interesting. Like you have God showing David this incredible favor. He says, if I found favor in your eyes, which you think, okay, well, it seems like he has. Because he's giving him a place. And so the question then is, okay, so what is different from chapter 27 and chapter 21? Why is it that the first time David goes, they want to kill him, and the second time that David goes, they're like, let me give you one of the country towns. Like what's different? And what's different is the fact that David has 600 men with him this time. And it was not an uncommon practice in the ancient Near East for nations to hire mercenaries from other nations to fight for them. And the thought would be, hey, we'll hire someone from another nation to fight our battles for us so that we can still gain new territory, but we don't have to suffer the casualties ourselves. And so what Achish is doing, he's being opportunistic. He's saying, okay, well, we can still like conquer new lands, and David, we know he's a great fighter. I'll hire him to fight the battles for me that need to be fought. And what does he do to hire him? He gives him Ziklag. And Ziklag's really, it's amazing if you kind of zoom out and you see what God's doing. So this land, the land of Israel, the land that Saul is king over, is the land of Israel. It's the land that God promised to Abraham all the way back in Genesis chapter 15. Moses comes to take the land. When Moses comes to take the land that was promised to Abraham, there's a lot of land that God said, hey, Moses, this would be yours. But because of the inhabitants of the land, Moses was never able to overtake it. And one of the places that Moses was never able to overtake, that Israel was never able to pursue, was Ziklag. That actually, if you look at Joshua 15:31, it says that was promised to God's people, but they never got it. But now here you have David. He gets the land that was promised to Moses by just going in and seeking asylum. Like you see the grace of God on his life and how God is using these interesting means to accomplish his purposes. And so now he has this land, Ziklag, and it says that Ziklag remained an Israelite possession when this was being written. And so you have the grace of God resting on him, and then you have David's cunning on display. And if everything up to this point was maybe just like questionable at best, as we move forward in the text, this is probably when David's wickedness comes out, and you see it here in verse 8. So they're mercenaries, they're making raids for the Philistines, and this is a picture of what they do. It says, now David and his men went up and made raids against the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. For these were inhabitants of the land of old, as far as Shur to the land of Egypt. And David would strike the land and would leave neither man nor woman alive, but would take away the sheep, the oxen, the donkeys, the camels, and the garments, and come back to Achish. When Achish asked, where have you made a raid today? David would say, against the Negeb of Judah, or against the Negeb of the Jerahmeelites, or against the Negeb of the Kenites. And David would leave neither man nor woman alive to bring news to Gath, thinking lest they should tell about us and say, so David has done. Such was his custom all the while he lived in the country of the Philistines. And Achish trusted David, thinking, he has made himself an utter stench to his people Israel. Therefore he shall always be my servant. Now, what you have David doing is he's being very shrewd and cunning. And I just want to show you he's not being honest. If you look at the places that David went, okay, it says that he attacked the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. That's where David actually went. But when he comes to Achish and tells him where he actually did go, he says he went to Judah. He says he went to that really long place, or against the Kenites. And so what he's doing is he's saying, he's not doing what he's saying. And so you have the king of the Philistines, you have Achish hearing and looking at David making these reports, and he's thinking, oh man, I've got him. He's killing his people. And if he's killing his people, he'll never be able to go back. That if he's aware of the fact that David's wants to be king someday, and he's thinking, if David is killing his people, they will never put him on the throne. And so he's feeling really good. He's thinking, David will always be my servant because he'll need me now. When the truth is, what David's doing is he's camping out in Philistine territory, and he's just fighting Israel's other enemies while he's doing it. And the Philistines are probably funding it a little bit. And so what David's doing is he's actually achieving this level of like folk hero status that just continues to grow. But even though that's the case, the ends don't justify the means. That on two occasions here in the text, it says that David completely wiped out whole cities and spared no person. And the reason why? It's probably because he knows what Westerns say, which is that dead men tell no tales. And so his thought is that if I kill everyone, no one is going to be able to tell Achish what I'm doing. And what David is doing is he is trying to accomplish God's will his way. And commentators really alike, they agree on the fact that what David was doing here was wrong. And I like the way that the commentator Goeden said it. He said it this way, just speaking of what David's doing. He said David was brilliant and successful. If he stopped there, you'd be like, wait, but he slaughtered whole communities and lied through his teeth in the process. He left his principles in the mountains and boxed himself in a corner where deceit and ruthlessness were the staples that kept him alive. And I mentioned before that this is not the first time that David and Achish have crossed paths. The last time David crossed Achish's path, it was in 1 Samuel chapter 21. And really David viewed it as God spared his life there. And it was such a significant moment to David, 1 Samuel 21, that he actually wrote a psalm in response to what happened in 1 Samuel 21. Now, considering everything that's happened in chapter 27, it almost feels like he's completely abandoned what he wrote in that psalm. He wrote Psalm 34. He wrote Psalm 34 after the first time he was spared from Achish. Let me read just a line from the psalm. He says this. He says, "Keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking deceit. Turn away from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it." Okay, if we had to put a verse over what we just read, it wouldn't be that one. You look at it and you're like, I'm pretty sure he did nothing that he said he was supposed to do there in Psalm 34. And okay, so there's a part of it, right, that was kind of frustrating where you're like, man, this is the problem with the church, is they say one thing and they do something else. This is the issue. And I would just say, man, it is really easy to throw stones at people when they're under a lot of pressure. And I would imagine that us, if we were to be really honest in this room, we have caved and abandoned our principles for far less than David did here in this moment. I remind you that David's on the run for his life. I remind you that David has no place to lay his head. I remind you that David has a promise from God that doesn't seem further away from the truth. And so if we were to put ourselves, we have caved when someone looked at us funny before. But still the question is, okay, how do you, under pressure, remain strong? How do you, because all of us are going to be placed with moments where the pressure is going to be on us and we're going to have to decide, okay, who do I want to serve? Do I want to honor God and what he wants from me, or do I just kind of want to serve myself? It will happen. And so the question is, why did David abandon this? And you see why in the first verse. Look at this in verse 1. It says, "Then David said in his heart, 'Now I shall perish one day by the hand of Saul.'" That everything that he did started with what he told himself. And I would imagine that if we were to consider some of the destruction that comes in our lives, or the destruction that we've experienced in our lives, the relationships that have exploded, circumstances where we did things that we should and that we're kind of embarrassed about. If we were to really consider all of those things, and we were to roll back to the beginning point of all of those things, I imagine that very similar to David here, we'd probably be able to find something that we said to ourselves. Something that we said to ourselves. And the thing is with David, he was up against the wall. He was in a difficult spot. Saul really was trying to kill him. But I would point out that there are other things that David could have told himself in that moment. And I want to maybe look at just two other things that David could have told himself in that moment as we consider the times in our lives where our backs are going to be against the wall too. But the other thing that David could have told himself in that moment is he could have focused on God's promises. That he could have told himself the promises of God that were given to him specifically. That we live in a society, okay, where it's not always about what is actually true, it's about what's true to you. And the problem is when we focus on what is true to us or your truth, the problem is when your truth isn't the truth, you get yourself into trouble. And if you were to look at David in this moment, what is his truth? His truth is that someday Saul is going to kill me. The problem is that was in contradiction to the truth that God had already told him. I just want to show you against each other what David said to himself against what God told him in 1 Samuel 16. So this is David's truth. His truth is, now I shall perish one day by the hand of Saul. In that moment, he thought it was true, but here's the problem, that it was completely contradictory to the promise that God had given him earlier. That in 1 Samuel 16, Samuel goes and he anoints David, and when he sees David, the Lord says, "Arise and anoint him, for this is he." And then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from this day forward. That God, those two things, they both can't be true. If Saul kills him, that never happens. If Saul kills David, he's never king. He gets to choose what he tells himself. That in that moment when he's afraid, he can say, surely Saul will take my life. Or he can say, God told me he would make me king. And for us, it's true as well. That when we're up against the wall, we get to choose what we tell ourselves too. Do we want to remind ourselves of the promises of God? Or do we want to tell ourselves why our problems are going to get the best of us? Now, the scriptures are chock full of promises that we can rest in. But one I would just give you today for the sake of this context is I would show you is Hebrews chapter 13. And it says this. It says, he has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So we can very confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? Now, in the moment where your back's up against the wall, when you're afraid, where you don't know what to do, you get to choose what you tell yourself. This is something that you can tell yourself. And it's very important. It's very important because it's not saying, hey, you're not going to have any problems. It's not. It's actually kind of assuming that you will. But what it's telling you is saying that just because you have a problem, just because something is before you that you wouldn't want, just because there's something you wouldn't sign up for, it doesn't mean that God has abandoned you. It doesn't mean that he's forsaken you. That you can walk through the valley of the shadow of death, and he can still be with you while you walk through it. And that just because you're walking through something, it doesn't mean that he has forsaken you. And here's the thing. When your back's up against the wall, you get to choose what you want to say. Do I want to focus on God's promise, or do I want to focus on my problem? If you focus on your problem, you're probably going to end up going somewhere you wouldn't want to go. But if you focus on God's promises, what will happen is your faith will grow, and you'll have more resolve and character to get through it. So you see his promises. The other thing that David could have told himself in that moment was he could have told himself about God's faithfulness. That God had been faithful to David. If you were to think of what we've covered so far in 1 Samuel, and you were to give 1 Samuel a sub-theme, it would be how God has delivered David from the hand of his enemies. I just want to show you, these are all the scriptures so far that we've covered where God has delivered David from the hand of his enemies. I could read them all to you, but that would be super boring. Every single one of these, in one way or another, God is delivering David from the hand of his enemies. So as David is sitting there talking to himself, he could say, Saul's scary, but Goliath was bigger. And God delivered me from Goliath. He could have said that. It would have been true. He could have said, it's kind of weird. I had a meteoric rise. I went from shepherding to leading an army, and I had success everywhere that I went. That probably didn't happen because I knew what I was doing. And if God enabled me to fight, he'll give me what I need here in this moment. He could have told himself that. He could have thought, he even had 2 examples where God specifically delivered him from the hand of Saul before. He could have said, God has delivered me from the hand of Saul. He'll do it again. He could have focused on the past where God had already been faithful to him, but instead, he looked ahead to a future where he didn't know what was going on, and he just let fear creep in. And what I find very interesting is when you look at the text, that when whoever wrote 1 Samuel sat down and wrote 1 Samuel, they didn't write like chapter 1, verse 1. But those are things that we've added later just so that we can find things easier. And so a lot of this stuff is like really, really close together. And so in chapter 26, what happens is God delivers David from the hand of Saul. And when he delivers David from the hand of Saul, I want to read to you what David said. And I just want to remind you, this is 2 verses before he said in his heart that he was going to die from Saul. 2 verses earlier, this is what he says. He says, "So may my life be precious in the sight of the Lord, and may he deliver me out of all tribulation." God delivers from Saul. He says this 2 verses later. He says in his heart, "Surely Saul's going to kill me." And isn't that like us? Like we have moments where God comes through. We have stories of God's faithfulness. There are things that we like can hold on to where we're like, man, God came, he was there for me. And then just like something little happens. And all of a sudden we start getting in our heads and we come up with all the reasons why this time is going to be different and it's going to be worse. And I imagine for some of us, if we were to think of our relationship with God, that we would see it as like a roller coaster. That we have moments of God's faithfulness that we hold on to, that we remember, and then we also have moments where we're like, what is happening? And the way to get through it, it's not to remove yourself from the world. The way to get through it is to make it a habit of reminding ourselves of God's promises and reminding ourselves of God's faithfulness.
Thank you for watching us on YouTube today. We hope that the content that you heard helped you know Jesus better.
Also, don't forget to click subscribe and to click the bell icon so that you'll get notified every time our channel drops a new video.
If you would like to partner with us in what God is doing here at New Life, there are 3 ways that you can give.
You can give by mailing a check to the church, you can give by going to giving.nlspringfield.com, or you can text 84321 with the amount that you'd like to give.
And if you would like to connect with us in any other way, you can visit us at nlspringfield.com, click on the Connect tab, and we will get back to you as soon as we can.
See you next week.